Okay, comrades, I'd like to welcome everybody to this special meeting of the Workers' International Network. We're really privileged to have with us Halima Khan, who can give us a first-hand eyewitness account of what life was like on the West Bank in the period after 7th of October. Of course, we know about the absolutely horrific and monstrous carnage and bloodbath in Gaza, but perhaps less attention has been given so far to the brutal treatment and reprisals that were taken also on the West Bank. And Comrade Halima Khan was there on the spot at the time, and she's a very good person to give a first-hand report, because apart from having been there on the premise on the site of these atrocities, she also has something of a personal record in exposing criminality closer to home as well. She seems to have a habit of finding herself right on the hot spot, in that she was the heroic figure, and I mean that in the full sense of the word, because it took immense personal courage. She was the whistleblower who provided much of the information for the program, the Al-Jazeera program, the Labour Files, on the corruption and malpractices of the Labour Party bureaucracy during the Corbyn period. Perhaps we can persuade her on another occasion to give us an introduction to a discussion on that topic too. But for now, I'm very glad to welcome you, Halima. If you would give us an introduction of maybe 20, 25 minutes, and we'll open up a discussion on the events in Palestine and perhaps a broader discussion on perspectives for the peoples of that region. So, Comrade Halima.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. So, as Roger quite rightly stated, I was Investigations and Governance Officer of the Labour Party, for those that don't know me, and I was also chair of the BME network. So, what happened, after the Labour files was essentially released, I found myself completely isolated. In all these legal battles that I was facing against the Labour Party. And then, the way that the Labour Party works is that I would kind of describe it as there's an establishment left and then there's an establishment right. And everybody who is, grassroots working class that are trying to make a difference are kind of isolated from the people or the powers at the top. And that's how it's designed to be, that we're supposed to be told ideas that we have to follow, or you're kind of shafted as a crank or whatever, essentially. So once I whistle blew, I found myself in a very isolated place where I was battling all these legal issues and all these things that were going on. Actually, just before the Al Jazeera Labour Files documentary came out, I was in Palestine for the first time for 2.5 months, because once I'd given my statements and my interview for the Labour Files, I was just very concerned whether or not I'd ever be able to enter Palestine. So as soon as the cameras stopped rolling, I decided to get a book a flight, and then a week later I was in Palestine. And then that's just how the story went for the first time. So when I came back 2 days before the Labour Files released. Then the Labour Files released, and I had some of the world's largest law firms coming down on me, threatening me, all sorts. These are ongoing legal cases that are still going on about, trying to silence me, trying to prevent me from speaking out, essentially. But in that stage in my life, I also had many people who are prominent figures on the left. So you can imagine it's people from Starmer's camp and Corbyn's camp working together to ensure that I'm not able to speak. And it's because for me, I've always stood for the truth, whether or not it's pretty. But I, owe it to the general public, regardless of the public's view on me as a Muslim, as whatever, but everybody deserves to know the truth. So having said that, because I didn't completely, align myself in protecting either side, both sides had a part to play in silencing me. So then that left me in a position where, I wasn't even supported by Al-Jazeera either, because I didn't sign an NDA with them either. Um, so essentially, I've in this position where I'm still fighting my legal cases and defending myself. So what happened last year was I was really struggling with my mental health, dealing with all of this, and all I wanted was to go back to Palestine and be with my friends, where I felt there was much more support and solidarity. They'd heard my story, and obviously they're my close friends now. And I just felt that, I felt less suffocated. And it's quite insane to say that I had to go into a war zone to feel less suffocated, because I felt there was, you know, that understanding of what suffocation feels like, where, there's so much that is against you, and it's powerful figures that you can't really fight alone, and that kind of stuff. So it was, my close friend from Janine, it was her wedding, and she invited me to her wedding. And I was kind of umming and ahhing about going as well. But in the end, I decided that I'm going to go to the wedding because, I had a employment tribunal hearings and, submissions that I had to do. And I was like, I'd rather go and do it there, where I'm around my friends, in a place where I'm happy and I feel more productive, and I feel, more charged that actually I can make a difference while I'm here. And then it kind of motivated me to keep fighting, because I did feel like giving up, with all these legal costs, and just, you know, I didn't want to say that, I wanted to be in a position where they were going to win, as in the Labour Party and the establishment that are coming for me. But I felt like it was easier to not give up while I was in Palestine, because I'm there in the front line seeing the realities. So that was my decision. I decided I was going to travel there, finalize my legal issues over there, do my preliminary hearing. Sorry, my cat is just jumping on the computer. Um, so then, a few weeks later, while I was there in Palestine, actually, a lot of me and my friends felt a lot of anxiety for the first few weeks. And we couldn't really pin why we were feeling so much anxiety. But, there was something in the air that we felt, and collectively we felt, I was having a lot of nightmares before the war began, before October the 7th. And so were a lot of my friends, and we just felt uneasy. So at that time, the wedding was in Nazareth, and then I traveled to Ramallah. I was in the occupied Israeli territories for the first few weeks, and then I decided, okay, after the wedding, I'm going to go into the West Bank and see all my friends in the West Bank, spend time in Jerusalem, etc. So I was in Ramallah when the war broke out. Now, the kind of feeling that we had when we woke up, and generally the people in Ramallah, was nervousness, because obviously when we're seeing what was happening, actually, now when we look back at October the 7th and how we were in the first few days, and the news that we were receiving, there's a lot of things that are just not focused on anymore at all, in terms of the timeline of events specifically. I remember in the second day of the war beginning, on the 8th of October, we were all looking at our phones, monitoring, where, there was rumors and like speculation that Al-Qassam brigades had made it to just 20 minutes away from Hebron. So we were still anticipating, are the soldiers, are the militants going to come and cross over to the West Bank? Is this the beginning of, the complete occupation crumbling? So when it came down to, as the days were going on, the West Bank became more and more suffocated. And I was quite concerned, as somebody who's British, and somebody who's a whistleblower from the Labour Party. What am I going to face at the borders? So essentially, I had made that decision that, I was going to try and get back to Jerusalem at least, because then when I go to Jerusalem, uh, all the international UN staff, the NGO staff, journalists, everybody had left at October the 7th, and then they started leaving more and more as the days went. So that's when I started getting contact from the British Embassy, essentially just saying that, they were sending out alerts, register yourself if you're in the area and you have to leave, essentially. So for me, I felt that it was a big personal test. If I advocate for the Palestinian cause, am I really just going to abandon my friends because my state says that I need to leave? For me, it wasn't a decision that, I felt was tenable. And I felt that I, had a duty to, see for myself whether or not I am who I say I am, and prove to my friends that actually there are many, many people that if they were in my position who would have stayed, and that we do support you. We haven't, as a British person, we haven't abandoned you and we won't abandon you. And I felt that that was so important for me to be a representative of just the normal British working class people and how our identity is. Like I said, when we compare that all the NGO stuff, everybody else had left, I knew then that I'm going to stay. So on the third day, my friends from Jerusalem randomly called me, and it was at a time when movement was just very, very difficult, and actually movement is still difficult. So a friend from Jerusalem, he contacted me and he said, look, we're coming to Ramallah. Do you want to come back with us? And I said, absolutely. I'll just pack my stuff. I'll come back to Jerusalem. And he had with him an American friend who was there traveling as well. And the American friend is Sudanese. So he has this long Arabic name on his American passport, etc. And he, unfortunately for him, arrived on the morning of October the 7th. So what they had given him was an 8-day visa, which was also very strange because for anyone that's from America or Europe, you get given a 3-month visa, but he was given an 8-day visa. So when we came to the first checkpoint, we arrived at Kalandia checkpoint, which is the one that's closest to Jerusalem, essentially. And when we had arrived at the checkpoint, the soldiers had, excuse me, had asked for us to give up our IDs, essentially. So we complied. But unfortunately, with Americans, and I'm gonna say this quite lightly, but he still had a bit of an attitude that I'm American, he kind of was a bit hostile to the Israeli soldiers. In any other normal circumstances, okay, we understand, but at the circumstance where these, you have to really to survive in Palestine, and as the Palestinians survive, you have to understand the psyche of the Israeli soldiers, essentially. So for me, it was clear that these are, 18, 19, 20-year-old soldiers who are also terrified. It's 3 a.m. and a car's pulled up, and, this is now the 4th day of the war. And essentially, he was very aggressive, and he was like, what, like, I've given you my ID, and she was asking for a visa. Then when he gave the visa to her, he said it in Arabic, like he was speaking to her in Arabic, essentially. Now that set her off, the soldier. She was like, we found one, we found one. This one's from the West Bank. Where is your other ID? We know you're hiding the other ID. She started taking pictures. Now the car was completely surrounded, essentially. So luckily for us, my friend from Jerusalem had been able to speak fluent Hebrew. So he kind of calmed the tensions down and was like, look, he's American, he's scared, he doesn't understand, like blah, 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 all of those things. And then they refused us. So when they refused us, we had to go to a second checkpoint. We went to a second checkpoint. And then there was another soldier who immediately flagged down our car, and they said, no, turn around, you're not getting entering. Even though 2 of my friends were from Jerusalem, they had the Jerusalem ID. I have a British passport. And then the other passenger was an American with an American passport. They didn't let us go through. So then we go to the third checkpoint, and they stop the car, and then they don't speak to any of my friends. I'm with 3 males. They pull me out the car, and then they take me to an interrogation room, and there's about 7 of them, and I look at them immediately, and I'm thinking, okay, you're all younger than me, and I'm going to, like, again, to make it through, I had to essentially see them as not soldiers and see them as 20-year-olds and, try and understand what that psyche is, right? So essentially, they were like to me, do you know this guy from America? Of course, I didn't really know him. But I said to them, yeah, he's my friend from America. We've known each other for a while. And then they said, are you guys together? As in, are you in a relationship? So at that moment, I just was like, no, he's not my type. And that kind of made them laugh. One of the things that I, do talk about a lot when in terms of how I survived and managed to survive through Palestine is that unfortunately, like I said, when you start to understand the psyche of the Israeli soldiers, a lot of them are perverts and they do have this kind of sexual kind of gratification of having this kind of power that they have. And unfortunately, to kind of surpass and survive as a woman, it is easier because of that, because they do overly sexualize women, and they do overly, want to show this kind of attitude, or they have this belief that they can get anybody and whatever. And if they see a pretty woman, they kind of have to balance out being a tough guy, but also trying to attract them and trying to woo them over. So essentially, when I'd made that comment, I said, no, he's not my type. They were like, oh, so what is your type? And I just said, not him, essentially. And then they let me go and then they let us through. So at that point, I was staying in the old city of Jerusalem. So the old city of Jerusalem, I don't know if anybody's been to Jerusalem, but the old city of Jerusalem is essentially where the Palestinians live, and there's many gates, and essentially at every single gate there is Israeli checkpoints, checking everybody and whatever. Their role is to harass Palestinians. They don't exist in West Jerusalem. They only exist around the old city and in East Jerusalem. So essentially, when I had arrived in Jerusalem at 4 a.m. with my suitcase, and where I was staying was inside the old city, I just said to my friend, look, I can't really enter now, because if I enter the old city now by myself, it's going to raise so many flags, arriving at 4 a.m. in the middle of the night with a big suitcase, it's just not safe. So me and my friend had to stay up and stay awake until the following morning and just wait in the car until it was 8 o'clock or whatever. Then we could actually just, I could enter by myself. Again, it wasn't safe for my male friends to come with me either. So then, how things progressed was, I had close friends of mine that were in Bethlehem at that time, the first 2 months of the war. So, I had a 3-month visa. I decided to stay to the end of my visa, which ended just before Christmas. When at that time, as the days were going on, basically how I would best describe the situation was the oppression and suffocation and the occupation in Gaza is nothing like anything else we've ever seen before in human history. Essentially, the way that those people are being suffocated and slaughtered, and the mechanisms of it is entirely unique, and it's never, been seen before. So then what happened to West Bank was West Bank became exactly like Gaza was before. So essentially all of my friends were trapped within their own cities, because there was, obviously between every single city there's a lot of settlements. There's the illegal Israeli settlements between every single city. So essentially Ben-Gvir, within the first week of the war, said, started handing out M16s and bullets to every settler. We immediately started seeing, everyone, even in Jerusalem, though it's considered an international city, walking around with big rifles and M16s holding their children. All of the police from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, they'd have, 2 types of police: regular police, which look like American police. They'll have the small pistols. And that's for the west side. Then in the east side, they'd have these border police who had the same small pistols, but they had the bigger guns with the rubber bullets. So a week into the war, when Ben-Gvir pushed through this new legislation that everyone should have live rounds, that's when we saw hybrid police in and around Jerusalem, but East Jerusalem specifically. So that's when, we had military walking in their tens and hundreds, often just stomping around just to threaten people in East Jerusalem. So again, as I go back, the West Bank cities all became like Gaza, where people can't leave from one city to another. I couldn't go and visit my friends in Bethlehem, which is again just across that wall at that time. There was no way of anyone entering and I didn't want to put any Palestinians at risk for taking me there, essentially. So, people from Hebron couldn't go to Bethlehem, which is, very short distance between them, essentially. So to this day, people still aren't really traveling between the cities in the West Bank because of the settlers and, the fact that they've just got a license to kill and, there's Israeli checkpoints at every point. So then when I say that the West Bank had become like Gaza, Jerusalem itself had become like the West Bank, where there was now military checkpoints. And the difference between Jerusalem is that news doesn't actually come out from Jerusalem. We hear very, very little of what happens in Jerusalem unless there's a mass group, where we've seen now where they've put tear gas in Masjid al-Aqsa because there's so many people there. But when, all the foreigners had left, essentially, I had to start deleting apps from my phone as well, because they would randomly stop anybody just to look at their phone to see what they're posting. Even if I was caught saying Free Palestine or just had a flag of Palestine on my phone, I could have got arrested. So essentially, people in Jerusalem were extremely monitored. That, there was an incident that where, again, I'll have to explain that in a different context through a different story. But, when I talk about how me being, a female who looks the way that I do, where it saved me in a lot of instances, but also put me at risk in a lot of instances. There was one night where I was coming into the old city and I had my coat zipped up and I had my hands in my pockets because it was very cold. It was December. And it was the middle of the night, and I was being followed by the Israeli soldiers. Now, I was being hosted by a Palestinian family, so I didn't want them to know where I was staying, essentially. So I could hear footsteps behind me, and as I was going up to the stairs where I was staying, it leads up to the Christian quarter. The Israeli soldiers never use that, and it's kind of like an alleyway. So essentially, there's cameras at every point of the old city, but the cameras are all monitored by Israeli soldiers. Palestinians have no access to these cameras. So when I was being followed, essentially, I had 3 men completely surround me, right? And in the middle of the night, and they're holding their big rifles. And they asked me directly, "Are you Muslim?" And my response was yes, but I think, again, because my accent is so strong, they kind of didn't know what to do. They got closer and didn't know what to do, but then they were like, "Where are you from?" One of them was like, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from the UK." So then that's when they kind of got stuck and they got backed off a little bit. So, if I was not British, 100% things would have gone down a very horrible, horrible road at that night. And I felt it at that point that was something that what they were intending. So again, when I was going back to when I say news doesn't really come out of Jerusalem, there was this incident where this girl from Jerusalem was taken by the Israeli police and she was sexually assaulted and beaten for no reason, and yes, she was sexually assaulted and beaten, and then her younger brother the next day was just completely enraged, didn't know how to deal with it, went to the border police and went to attack them. And then what happened was the Israeli soldiers, obviously now they've got live rounds, they decided to shoot, obviously shoot the kid, kill the kid, but also that one of their bullets misfired and killed their own soldier. So the story that came out in the public was this young terrorist was killed because he shot the Israeli soldier at the checkpoint it's called Bab al-Khalil. But what actually happened, with eyewitnesses that were there, there was many people were there. He didn't have a weapon on him. So he didn't have a gun. He didn't shoot anything. It was a young 16-year-old boy that got killed. But obviously these stories, can't come out. They, for the people in Palestine, they can't go and say, no, this actually didn't happen. This is the truth. Because that night they would get arrested or something would happen to them. And an arrest is the least of their worries. If any Palestinian is charged with anything, it usually ends up with their house being blown up, as you all may be aware. So, another incident again that probably is not well known was that after the war began, essentially the Israeli government cancelled everybody's permits. So, there was Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank who had permits to work or to go seek medical aid, etc. So there was there was about 53 patients in the Palestinian Maqasid hospital in East Jerusalem. So I remember driving down, seeing the military outside this hospital, and we didn't know what was going on. But again, it was one of those things, you can't stick around too long, right? You can see what's going on, and then you sorry. So essentially,
Sorry about that.
no, it's absolutely fine. So essentially, what happened that night was 53 patients and their family were taken out of the hospital, unplugged from their machines, essentially, and were kidnapped to the point that nobody knew where they went. It then obviously came out later that they were just thrown back into Gaza, in the middle of Gaza. So the true level of crime that, and the mechanisms of genocide, really taking sick patients, sick children off their machines, off dialysis machines, off, straight out of hospital and just throwing them back into Gaza. Again, these things, it's like, where do you begin? Where does it end when you try and describe the horrors of what's happening to Palestinians? Then I must speak about the second level, which another layer of the occupation that Palestinians do not have the ability to speak about. But this is why it's our duty as people who support Palestinians and the Palestinian cause to speak more about is the Palestinian Authority's cooperation with the Israeli government. So essentially, when I was in Ramallah for the first few days, I saw all of these men essentially just being thrown into schools, and they were people from Gaza whose permits had been cancelled. So essentially, they were rounded up by the Israeli government and just chucked into Ramallah. So what happened was these people were then, I remember, and it's an image that will always haunt me. I remember seeing these men panicking in the middle of the night, just calling, just on the phone, trying to get hold of their family members, because we were seeing on the news what was happening in Gaza almost immediately. And, their cries were that they want to be there. They don't want to be, somewhere in the middle where their family are there. And, a part of that was that they felt that guilt that, we left our family to go and work and earn an income, and now they're stuck in Gaza and we can't even come back. So essentially, what the Palestinian Authority did was then grab these people and then move them to Jericho. So then a few weeks later, what happened was the Israelis then came and said, we want those people from Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority handed them over. So then when we saw the images of the Palestinian detainees, where did they come from? They came directly from the West Bank, essentially. So these are as I said, when we talk about the collaboration of the Palestinian Authority, it is absolutely our duty to talk about that, because that's something that the Palestinians cannot speak about. They cannot mention these things because, again, it will put them at severe risk. The other thing that, again, is not common knowledge that I came to know while I was there, because I was seeing it happen, was that the Iron Dome, right? The Iron Dome exists to protect the Israeli society from any kind of missiles. But the Iron Dome does not work in Palestinian villages, even inside Israel, right? And it does not protect Palestinian villages inside Israel, and it does not protect Palestinian villages in Jerusalem either. So a lot of missiles fell that we saw fall. Like I remember one time being in East Jerusalem in Salahdin Street, and I was with in a shop just speaking to the shop owner, and essentially I could see like the Palestinians coming outside because we could hear something falling, right? And that's when the shop owner said to me, "Oh, Halima, are you scared?" And I said, "Are you scared?" And he was like, "No." And then I was like, "Then why should I be scared?" Essentially. So when we heard it fall, it fell literally just outside Salahdin Street. So essentially, this Iron Dome that exists, that is completely funded by America, and they say that, oh well, when you take Israeli citizenship, you're protected. Oh, Israeli Muslims have more rights than Muslims in any other Muslim country. All of these things, it's complete fabrication. As I said, that even the Iron Dome doesn't protect Palestinian villages inside the Israeli territories. Now, the last thing that I also wanted to talk about is that there was a number of Israeli passport holders, Palestinians with Israeli passports, that were stuck in Gaza when the war began, right? Now, there's this organization called Hamaket, which is an Israeli NGO that supports legally Palestinians, for any kind of issues that they might find themselves in. Now, they worked to try and desperately get these, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship out of Gaza. And there are a large number of them that were there, right? So again, these are people that are completely unaccounted for. They don't talk about them, and they're not considered Israeli citizens. So no matter what, Israeli, the propaganda of the Israeli government and Zionism is that, even if there's a one-state solution and it all becomes Israel, it will never stop being an apartheid state. It will never stop treating Palestinians or anybody that isn't Jewish as second-class citizens. It's a farce, because you can take that as a test, as a litmus test. How were the Palestinians with Israeli citizens in Gaza treated? Why were they never accounted for? Why were they never spoken about? Is because they are not equal, and they will never be equal, essentially. So, as I go back to when I said that, the Palestinians in Gaza is another level of oppression and occupation, then how West Bank became like Gaza, what Gaza was before the war, where people are trapped, no one can enter or leave. Then Jerusalem became like the West Bank. Essentially, Palestinians with Israeli passports then became like Jerusalemites, where they were treated like Jerusalemites. So my friends who have Israeli passports from Haifa, Palestinians with Israeli passports, were then heavily monitored, weren't able to speak about anything. They were also being attacked in their universities, and the police would just step aside and allow these attacks to happen, essentially. So where we say that the Israeli occupation has essentially taken everything up a notch, then it's clear to see that it's not about the war in Hamas. It's not about the hostages. It's about fast tracking whatever their agenda and what they've always wanted to do. And this was just a helpful occasion to it was just something that they've utilized to fast track, all these illegal settlements in the West Bank. Jenin hasn't stopped being raided every single night. What has Jenin got to do with the hostages or Hamas, essentially? So, yeah. If anybody has any questions, sorry if I seemed quite disjointed and just rambling, but
No, well, thank you very much, Halima. On the contrary, it was absolutely fascinating. It was as gripping as any. Everybody to mute, please. It was as gripping as any thriller or horror story, but the tragedy is that it's actually taking place right now. And I'm sure comrades have a lot of questions and points they'd like to make. So can Who wants to go first? I'm sure if you like to just carry on and supplement your reports, but it's been really fascinating. If there are any specific questions, please indicate now. David.
Well, first of all, my greatest respect to you, Halima. It's really marvelous to hear. A lot of it cut me quite sharply because what you were describing was what we had in South Africa, and the choices that you're making, the very delicate choice between standing up for your rights or signing your arrest and or certificate for torture, all of those things are very much, it resonated in my mind. It's exactly the kind of question which was on Steve Biko's mind when he, in his very courageous way, repudiated the security police. And I know he must have done that right to his dying breath, but, that also made things inevitable. In other words, there's all kinds of subtleties is the wrong word, but there are all kinds of stratagems for survival, and we need to survive. And it's a complete, your honesty and sensitivity to those issues was absolutely marvelous. So, I just want to say that the points that you made about the lack of Iron Dome, the lack of protection for citizenship of people who are human beings, also regarded as Israeli citizens but not citizens, all of that is the kind of detail which you'll never see in a newspaper. It'll never come across, but actually it explains whole chunks. When I watched before the 7th of October, the uprising in Gaza, well, it wasn't really an uprising, it was a surge towards the border. And the troops, and I've served in the military, and the troops took out the kneecaps, of those boys who were advancing, and did it deliberately with a sense of satisfaction. Then I knew well before the 7th of October that something dreadful was about to happen. A complete lack of sensitivity, of military control, of professionalism, a disgusting lack of humanity, just because you're in a uniform. All of that, again, it resonates so much with my South African experience. Some things which are very hard to talk easily about, but I really found I learned so much from what you said. The questions, well, look, let's hear you more, and we probably have answers to those questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
David. Matthew? Halima, we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time, if that's okay with you.
Yep, sure.
Yeah. Matthew?
Hi, comrades. Yeah, thanks to Halima. It's a brilliant introduction, and obviously, the stuff we wouldn't hear anywhere else. I mean, the media we have is a propaganda service. Doesn't cover any of that reality, deliberately so, which is why obviously the Israelis are now moving to ban Al-Jazeera as one of the very few outlets whose journalists actually try to portray the truth, through whatever channel. I think the other thing, of course, as you say, and it's drawn out obviously, is the nature of the IDF as an ill-disciplined operation, which is it's nakedly racist, trigger happy, and the rest, which is just how obviously a colonial operation would behave, but worse. And the atrocities they've committed in Gaza, which is unspeakable in many cases. I think the other thing really, what we really interesting is that because obviously 1994 and the Oslo Accords marked the political collapse of the old Palestinian nationalism. It essentially sells itself to the Israelis and of course the US imperialism, which is what we're really dealing with, is this unity almost of US imperialism and Israel, because the one makes the other possible. What is then the political response among Palestinians to that, the collapse of that politics? Really interesting to see what sort of political tendencies there are now, developing out of that, the ending of that. And obviously, I mean, the Hamas itself, of course, was set up in cooperation with the Israeli secret police, notoriously, of course, in the late 80s, and it was a means of splitting the Palestinian nationalism. So I mean, in those terms, the notion of what political tendencies there are and the development of the thoughts of resistance, obviously, at present. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Is it John or Dominic?
Say it again.
John. Yeah.
John, I'd like to make 3 points. One was when Mala spoke at the start, and she said there was a feeling of foreboding before the 7th of October.
Yeah.
Now, when one looks at the reality of what happened on the 7th of October, the fact is that junior observers of the Gaza Strip, I don't know if they were working for the Israeli intelligence or the Israeli army, observed that there was a lot of training going on in Gaza and reported that to their superiors, who basically told them to mind their own business and not, interfere in things they knew nothing about. And when they reported it again, they were, threatened with disciplinary action. October the 7th itself was an absolute farce. The position was one that the people in Gaza were able to break out in large numbers and had free reign for a number of hours in southern Israel. And quite frankly, it brings me to my second point. I was watching a travelogue program today, and in this travelogue program, it was about a guy who was touring around the Mediterranean. And the bit I saw today had him in Israel, where he was visiting this huge desalination plant with only 2 people working in it. And it was, producing millions of litres of fresh water from seawater. And then he went from there into Gaza, and this is pre-October the 7th. And what came over was it was entering a very secure prison. It showed you a wall round Gaza, and it showed you this great big passageway that Gazans had to go through. It's about, I don't know how long, possibly a mile long. And this was, the way Gaza was. And it had, in Gaza, you had the various militant groups having their own checkpoints and that. And definitely it came over that Gaza was a real prison. And therefore, when Israel, when Hamas and the others came out of Gaza, it was with the prior knowledge of the Israeli government, because not only had these officials warned about the training programs that were going on in Gaza and the fact that the people from Hamas and the other groups were doing paragliding and things like that they'd never done before. and were told basically to shut up and mind their own business. You also had the head of Egyptian military intelligence phoning Benjamin Netanyahu 3 days before the 7th and warning him that something big was brewing in Gaza. Now, possibly, you were saying that there was a feeling of unease among yourself and your friends, in Palestine as to what was happening, just that feeling that something bad is going to happen. And I'm sure that, if it was junior officials, reporting that, they may well have been talking to their friends and saying that they were being told to keep silent and what have you. And quite frankly, the other thing that I found very disturbing when watching the television was this woman who was given the title of the grandmother of the settlers. And she talked about the fact of the day when, if you like, Gaza was going to be cleared of Palestinians, and what a wonderful place it would be, particularly on the Mediterranean coast, which she thought was a wonderful place. And she was going to have, a property there, and her friends were going to have properties there. And it just brings it back to the whole question of the settlers in, Palestine. The fact that whatever it is, whether it's 500,000, 700,000 or whatever, have taken over huge chunks of the West Bank, that they're driving people out quite blatantly. And if you like, the Western governments, and in this country, in Britain, if you like, the Labour leadership are acting dumb, in the face of all this, well, if you like, ethnic cleansing and genocide that's going on.
Just mention where she said the Palestinians should go.
And when the reporter asked this woman, where should the Palestinians go, or what you're going to do about the Palestinians, she said, well, they can go elsewhere. And he said, well, where? And she said, oh, there's plenty of room in Canada and Australia. There was just this callous attitude among, if you like, this woman who was representing that sort of settler movement. And if she's saying that, then Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu are probably thinking all the same things. That's the way I feel about it. Sorry for being a bit disjointed.
No, thanks, John. Very interesting points. There are a number of comrades who've got their hands up to speak. Halima, you'll have time to sum up at the end. But would you like to make any comments, just quick comments on the points that have been made so far? You have to unmute yourself, by the way.
No, I'd like to thank Christopher for his wonderful comments and sharing with us his experiences of apartheid South Africa. I think, it is very much important that we hear these stories as well, in terms of how history continues to have the tendency to repeat itself, and we still don't learn. And I'm not talking about we as the general public, I mean as the powers above us. So, and also Matthew's point on political tendencies, well, with the Palestinian Authority, essentially, they have done very, very well to protect any form of democracy happening. Whenever there has been an election, Mahmoud Abbas's government has never abided by the people's will. Essentially, when we see factions of resistance, where do they really occur? Right now, the biggest targets for the Israeli government has been Nablus and Jenin, essentially. So whenever there's been, some form of resistance and a movement that's growing amongst the youth, the Palestinian youth, particularly in Nablus and Jenin, it's always been the Palestinian Authority that's given Israelis the access to go and enter, essentially, or tell them directly where the Palestinian resistant fighters, the leaders of their movements, are hiding, essentially. So, you know, very recently there was an operation in Jenin, and you know, a day later, the Palestinian Authority went and then attacked and arrested the people who were then attacking the Israeli soldiers. So when it comes down to, you know, when we talk about who actually benefits the Israeli occupation, and Palestinians will be open and frank when you do visit them and you speak to them, that actually Mahmoud Abbas really benefits them. Have, you know, what the biggest threat to Israel is when Mahmoud Abbas actually gives up or passes away, and then there's a power vacuum. That is what the Israeli government is most afraid of, is when the people, you know, then decide for themselves their own leader that cannot be manipulated or controlled. Another key thing about that I've just remembered is that, you know, the Palestinian Authority creates a lot of cases and tries to arrest Palestinians for minimal crimes just so they can give a statistic to the Israeli occupation. So they will always give statistics at the end of the week and saying, we have arrested these people, we're doing our job, you know, you can leave us alone, essentially. So that's their relationship with the Israeli occupation. You know, when I say that they'll go and hunt and monitor people for small things like having a joint of hash or whatever, and then they'll keep them in prison for a whole year and that kind of stuff. They'll raid the house and all these things. That's what the Palestinian Authority is in terms of how they fully oppress Palestinian people. And why are they doing it? Again, it's to give those statistics to the Israeli occupation. Now, I know, and Dominic touched on October the 7th. You know, there's a number of things with October the 7th, and like another thing that we won't see much talk about in mainstream media, you know, whenever the mainstream media has ever talked about a religious war or, you know, a religious kind of like warfare that's going on about the end of times or whatever, it's always directed towards these Muslim, I'd say, because they're not Muslim at all, but these militant groups that come from Islamic regimes, essentially. But nobody really wants to talk about that the war in Palestine that's been fought by the Israeli occupation is religiously motivated. And I say this because when I was in Jerusalem, the Palestinians weren't allowed to move between places to places. They could not come to from their village in Shofat to come and visit me unless they had a car. They weren't able to walk on foot. I had to leave to go and visit my friends in their own villages because they were too scared to leave, because every night there was raids. The military would come in and start raiding villages in East Jerusalem, which again they wouldn't really do before October the 7th. They would only, you know, leave that for the refugee camps, like Shofat refugee camps. But after October the 7th, the military was going and raiding any village that it wanted to raid inside East Jerusalem. So, you know, we had this, you know, as I was saying, I was living in the old city and it's a short walk away from West Jerusalem. So I would take these walks late at night, again, walking from my friends' villages, from Sheikh Jarrah, trying to, you know, I'd go and visit them in their house and then walk back, essentially. And I'd go through West Jerusalem. And every single night, most nights, there were always drunk, you know, Zionists, essentially, and like celebrating. Essentially, they were always celebrating. When we went to, there's this place called Shuk Manyuda, which is the Jewish market, essentially, where they have like clubs and like bars and stuff like that. They were packed. And then when you'd speak to them and say, well, you know, what's going on? You know, you guys are celebrating, whatever. A lot of them would talk about the Messiah. And this is conversations that are happening inside Jerusalem. They are talking about the coming of the Messiah. And that's something that, you know, when you want to talk about the red heifer and all of that stuff, they don't want to talk about it so much. But when you talk about, when you try and understand, you know, why Hamas had called their operation on October the 7th the Al-Aqsa flood, it is entirely about this red heifer situation, where, you know, about destroying Al-Aqsa to rebuild the temple, essentially. That is where the naming comes from. So when we now think fast forward to where it's actually now public. You are seeing these stadiums built for the big sacrifice of the red heifer and all of those things. You know, we cannot ignore that it is now pushing towards this extreme, you know, side of Zionism, which is, you know, religious fundamentalism, which is no different to the ambitions of ISIS and how they wanted the Islamic State in Levant. This is now happening with the Zionist state, and this is why, you know, Netanyahu and this government decided to surround himself with the most religious extreme fundamentalists, like we say, Smotrich and Ben Gavir. You know, these are the most powerful figures and the most extreme figures that Israeli society has ever had in their cabinets, essentially making these executive decisions. So, you know, and again, another thing on October the 7th that never really gets spoken about was that the Al-Qassam brigades occupied the military bases for over 5 hours. And then there was no invasions inside southern Israel. We didn't see military tanks. There was no military tanks going and hunting for, you know, these Al-Qassam brigades, as there is when they go to the West Bank to hunt from little kids who are throwing rocks. Essentially, we see military invasions just hunting for, you know, teenagers that have, you know, done a small, like, you know, throwing rocks at checkpoints and essentially. But we didn't see any of that. And like I said, for Al-Qassam brigades to completely occupy a military base for 5 to 6 hours, they didn't go empty-handed. They took the lieutenants. But what else did they take with them? What information and what intelligence and what plans must have they taken with them to go and, you know, where we're in this position where everyone has to be decimated? What is the threat? You know, why is it that everything has to be completely flattened? You know, do the Qassam brigades have secret military information that they do not want to go outside? You know, and then you have to tie it up with why all the communications was the first thing to cut off. Again, it's not something usual. They didn't do that in the previous war, not in the 2021 war in Gaza. They didn't cut off all communications with Gaza, right? But this time it was one of the most immediate things that they put in, cutting off water, cutting off internet, cutting off any kind of communication.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's a number of comrades waiting to ask you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Too. So, I mean, I'm not saying stop now, but just keep it in mind.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think that was the last question anyways on the 3.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to actually cut you off.
No, it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine.
Okay,
I could go on forever, to be honest. But yeah.
You'll have plenty of time at the end to you know, continue
absolutely.
and fill in. Right, first Finn and then Ken.
I want to begin by thanking Halima for a very, very interesting and a very, very informative opening contribution. I spent some time myself in the West Bank some years ago, and from your description today, Halima, things have got so much worse. And it's good to focus in this discussion on the West Bank, because what's happening to Palestinians is not happening only in Gaza. This is a terribly difficult situation for Palestinians who live on the West Bank. When we arrived in Tel Aviv about 6 years ago, off a Turkish Airlines flight, we were immediately, our passports were taken. This is a trade union and socialist group from Ireland. We were confined in a room. Our passports were taken. 4 of our number were deported straight away back onto Turkish Airlines and sent back. And then we stayed for the rest of when we got our passports returned, we stayed in a hotel in Bethlehem. And during our visit, then we went to Hebron and Nablus and other Jericho and other places. But 2 of the most disturbing things which I noticed when I was there in Hebron, one was over the main market in the town of Hebron was a net. And the net was there to stop the rubbish which was being thrown by settlers onto the marketplace. The net was there to prevent the rubbish from landing on the people who were doing shopping in the market. A second thing which I found quite unnerving was the tomb of Abraham, that building there is divided between a Jewish and Muslim worshippers at different sides of the different entrances of the church. But a short distance from the church is a monument to Goldstein. And Goldstein is the Zionists who killed Muslims in that church with the tomb of Abraham. And the monument is fresh, and people bring mementos to the monument, and it's built with stones, small stones, newly laid as a tribute to this mass killer. Now, these are very disturbing things, but we saw all the rest of it, the roads and the confinement and the discrimination. We saw workers from Bethlehem who work in Jerusalem being funneled through cages, taking hours to get to work and to get back from work because of discrimination. And all this is happening in the West Bank. We saw settlers strutting around the town of Hebron carrying guns, large rifles on their shoulders on the main streets. And Hebron is a city which I'm sure you can tell us a bit more, Halima, is a city which the Israeli state wants to take away from. There's a Palestinian group there. They want to get rid of all the Palestinians. And already, when we were there, you could see the shops boarded up and Israeli flags being placed in every location they could around the city. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions you might deal with. When we were there, we met several groups. We met the Palestinian Authority. Actually, before I make that point, you made a very interesting point about the Palestinian Authority and the way in which they cooperate with the Israeli state in the oppression of the Palestinian population. And part of the reason for the growth of Hamas was exactly that, was because of the cooperation of the PA with the Israelis. Hamas then became a more serious opposition within the West Bank. It's not just a question of Gaza. A question you might look at also is that there have recently been fresh talks between Hamas and Fatah about a common political approach to the issue. Now, that's a new development. There was, after all, a civil war in Gaza between the PLO and Hamas back in 2007 or thereabouts. But now there are fresh talks. And I was wondering whether you have any insights to maybe explain what potential these talks might have about creating a common front in the struggle, justified struggle for Palestinian independence and national recognition. And another question we might have a look at, we met several groups there. We met the Palestinian Authority, we met B'Tselem, which is a human rights Israeli group, and Breaking the Silence, which are ex-soldiers from the IDF who openly declare their experiences. They had an exhibition recently in Dublin, actually, of photographs and statements from ex-army people who were involved at the time in expelling people from their homes, maltreating prisoners. They spelled it out openly in the Breaking the Silence group. So I was wondering whether you might have any information about whether they are continuing with that work, what influence it has, what influence B'Tselem might have. There's when we were in Bethlehem, we went to visit a refugee camp. And while we were there, inevitably, when the IDF soldiers appear in the vicinity, young kids start throwing stones at them. But I mean, that's not accidental. That's because people are being confined into these refugee camps, which they're not camps in the sense of tented cities. These are very, very narrow clusters of buildings where people live on top of each other at horrible conditions. So when the army appears, kids start throwing stones. They then tear gassed the area, and the tear gas got into the building where we were having a discussion with some refugee leaders, and we had to leave the building. That's a tear gas is all over the place outside. But that was tear gas. Now, of course, bullets have been used, and the experiences you've described are becoming more acute and more regular. So I'm just interested in your ideas about that. And just finally, then a question about progressive movements. There's a Palestinian Trade Union Federation, which brings together Palestinian workers. I was wondering whether you know much about the influence they might have in Palestine, in the West Bank, obviously, in particular. Although there was loads of workers, there was something like 30,000 workers from Gaza used to leave every day and go to work in Israel, and they were all sacked en masse. That was stopped after the recent escalation. But workers in the West Bank go into tens of thousands to work in Israel, and there were some joint activities between Jewish and Palestinian workers through trade union structures. No, they're not large groups, but they're still united action. There was action, common action in the port, I think the port of Haifa, maybe some other ports. There was common action also in the construction industry between Jewish and Palestinian workers who worked together. Now, all that, of course, would have changed somewhat since the recent escalation and mass killings and genocidal activities and the modern experiences which you can see in the telly. But if you have information, Halima, I'd be interested to see, because we have to find a way out of the crisis. There has to be a way out. And Israel won't be defeated militarily. It's not a simple military issue. There's issues of forming a common front, united front of Palestinian independence, how it's going to be achieved, and separation, recognition of the rights of Palestinians within the existing structures. And we need to also face the failure of the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo agreements to, I mean, first of all, they accepted the division anyway into the areas A, B, and C. They accepted Israeli supervision and control, both security and civil, in 2/3 of what's the West Bank. So I've been interested to hear your ideas about that and what you might see as a way forward from the point of view of securing Palestinian independence and recognition of the national rights, and also progress in terms of socialist movement, class movements within Palestine at the present time, what the possibilities might be and what the perspectives might be for the future. So once again, thank you very much for what I found a very interesting contribution. It just shows to me how much worse, it was 6 years ago we were there, how much worse the situation has got since we were there. By the way, our Palestinian tourist guide was taken off our bus because the bus had to cross over one of these roads which Palestinians can't use, and he had to meet us at the far side when we congregated once again to go to some site or other. But he, because he was a Palestinian, wasn't allowed, even on a bus, to travel along these roads which are exclusively for Israeli citizens. So anyway, thanks again for a very interesting and very informative contribution, Halima.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Ken, then Eric.
Thank you again, Halima. In light of everything you've said, it's very difficult to see what way forward there is after this. There's much chatter again about a two-state solution. Now, it doesn't seem remotely credible that Netanyahu is going to enter any negotiations on that front. And it's my understanding that, short of a vote of confidence, he will remain in power for 2 years. And I further find it difficult to see how anybody on the Palestinian side could feel any level of confidence about negotiating with certainly the present Israeli government or even a future Israeli government. So what do people in Palestine feel on that? Do they see any kind of political solution here, or do they simply see it a struggle to exist and a struggle to find some means of securing land and freedom for themselves? But how? I personally find it very difficult to see a way forward now. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what you believe people in the West Bank and Gaza and even in Jerusalem think on that front. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Eric.
Hey, hi, thanks. Thank you so much for the talk. Trying to get some of the young activists. I'm out here on the west coast of the U.S., California. It's early in the morning here. I did a shout out to try to get some people to come on, and it doesn't look like any of them did because it's early. Some of the other points have already been touched on. I wanted to raise. Israel isn't going to be defeated militarily. We know that. We also know that it's really rolling still because it's backstopped by the superstate of the United States. Part of that is religious, as has already been said. It's not just that there's a significant Jewish community here that's influential. We've got this huge kind of uniquely American evangelical Protestant thing, which tend to be, even in the Black community, very, very pro-Israel, even today. And that's a hard thing to cut through. You know, I'm online fighting with some of my mother's friends who, these 75-year-old Christian ladies in Sacramento, California, that's the Bible says back Israel, right or wrong. The movement's going fairly well in a sense here in the US, but like so many social movements, it's in the activist bubble. And I'm frustrated by this. And I'm kind of asking all of you, and particularly the sister that gave the talk, you know, a little bit of thought how to get this out to, you know, normal people in the main, at least here in the US. And there's tends to be generally a colloquial attitude in the US. The rest of the world is kind of on another planet, and we're here in the US. And I'm sure the government's probably doing the right thing, or maybe not. But yeah, there's this idea that it's just somewhere out in space. And so often what I perceive here happens is you'll get a demonstration in one of the big cities, New York or San Francisco or LA. Many thousands will come, but it's college students. It's people from Muslim backgrounds or Arab American backgrounds, and student youth. And some have radical or socialist ideas. And I'm kind of flummoxed by this. I'm frustrated. I just recently retired, but at work I would engage with my coworkers and try to argue with them. And if they had any kind of an opinion, it was either no opinion or just this kind of vague, well, Israel is like our friend and we should back them, shouldn't we? You know, and so anyway, I kind of want to open that up for a question. And then also I want to reiterate the other talking point of, obviously a two-state solution is kind of, if that ever made sense, I'm not sure it ever made sense, but there's got to be, because the charge is always leveled against the movement, it's anti-Semitic. Okay, you know, free Palestine lands badly outside of Arab American communities that don't know the history. They know about the Holocaust because we grew up watching documentaries about that as kids, you know, and it's kind of, so anyway, I'm sorry to leave you with these kind of big ticket questions, and I wish I had more to offer. You know, there are people here that are working on it, though. There are people here in the U.S. that go out and done some direct action, but we got to make the link to ordinary working class people and get it in their minds that this is in their interest. And thank you so much for everything you do. And the talk was so interesting. And I'll switch off and listen to the answer.
Right, thank you, Eric. Ian.
Hi, thanks. And just in response to the last thing Halima said in your introduction, I didn't think it was a disjointed talk at all. I thought it was really excellent and very stimulating on the ground knowledge that actually made me think of a couple of questions on that front, that and the discussion that we've had before I circle back to what I was wanting to ask from when I saw this meeting was going to happen. So first of all, just on, I thought it was very powerful, this idea of everyone's taken a step down. It actually reminds me of an old Labour Party poster, I think from the Great Depression or the 1920s, everyone take a step down. So the banker and the businessman and the duke are all taking a step down the ladder, and then the working man, they've got the water coming up to his mouth. And in terms of Gaza taking the furthest step down, it wouldn't be water but blood, because it's becoming a killing field. But even the Israeli Palestinian citizens of Israel being treated now more like Jerusalemites. It made me wonder, because one of the talking points I saw from the other side was when they were all expressing pleasant surprise at it, people like Barry Weiss, but her sharing slightly less unreliable info than simply something she'd made up herself, that the Arab citizens of Israel were in polls said to be more supportive of Israel than of Gaza. And I'm wondering if that's fake news, either because they were in such fear that they were lying to the pollster, or the pollster was doctoring or misrepresenting the polling from what you're getting on the ground, or if there is indeed cross currents of consciousness. You said that the Iron Dome didn't cover them, so they were particularly susceptible to missiles, but then that might mean they're particularly susceptible to the talking point that the missiles from Gaza are the main problem and not what the much bigger ordnance that Israel's firing back. So I wonder, yeah, how much of that did exist possibly in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th with a national feeling, perhaps like the initial sympathy to Israel in the world after that being washed away by the complete bloodbath in Gaza, or if it's still there, or if it, in your opinion, never really was. Responding to, I don't know if it was Dominic or John, sort of making the same point that got the Labour candidate for Rochdale suspended, though not thankfully making the the actually very dodgy point that Afzal Ali said about Andy McDonald being done in by Jewish sections of the media as opposed to the right wing of the Labour Party, of which Afzal Ali was part. But the first thing that he got into trouble for saying about Israel maybe knew the attack was coming and let it happen anyway. And it's a debate in Israel itself. So it's so there's nothing wrong in having the debate. I don't personally agree. I think that they took their eye off the ball. I think there might have been a racist misunderestimation of what Gaza was capable of. I think there was a focus on the West Bank, the feeling that things were going to blow up there with the settler fascists and government wanting to ethnically cleanse it. There was a Ben Gvir plan to push Gazans into Egypt as well, which interestingly 6 months into the genocide hasn't yet succeeded. And if it's not succeeding under these conditions and continues not to, I don't see how in some other time, few years down the line, it ever would. So there's a real samud of the people of Gaza that this hasn't already happened. But it always seemed like the weak link in Ben Gvir's plan. He was being a completist for the whole of Mandate Palestine, but there was much more settler activity in the West Bank, whereas Egypt is actually one of the key Israeli allies in the region under Sisi, so totally destabilizing it by sending in 2 million Gazans. I'm not sure was at the top of their priorities, and it has certainly proven that Netanyahu's securocratic approach, Mr. Security, has not worked. And I don't think it's something that's helped him in the long run. It's one of the reasons why he's wanting the war to go on as long as possible to avoid the reckoning, I think. So, yeah, I'm just wanting to put that out there that I think it was more a cock-up than a conspiracy in that way. I think the Palestinians had their back to the wall and something had to give. But I'd like to get back to my main question to Halima about, I missed the first couple of minutes of the talk, so you might have mentioned this. If your visit to Palestine initially flowed out of being the Labour whistleblower during this anti-Semitism crisis that was really got up because of Jeremy Corbyn's good position on this issue. Given how terrible even some of the left were on responding to the witch hunt, and I think you've had arguments about that on Twitter, forgive me if I'm mistaken, with the likes of Owen Jones and that kind of thing. One of the effects of the last 6 months is that inside what Eric called the activist bubble, at least the activist bubble have woken up on this. And I think in Britain, at least, which I could speak for, wider layers than that. But actually, until this latest Gaza genocide, the left were, the official left at least, were quite poor on this issue because of the witch hunt. On other wars, they were even worse. I think on Ukraine, the right wing were, if anything, more anti-war, perhaps opportunistically because of being Biden, with the Trump movement in America, more than the right wing here, who were more perhaps conventionally right wing and being pro-war. But in America, even some of the right now are generalizing from Ukraine towards not wanting to get too involved with a proxy war in Gaza either, people like Tucker Carlson. So, but in terms of the left, I wonder if you've been getting any apologies from people like Owen Jones and his ilk, Halima, if it's been helping rebuild relationships as well, that people are taking better positions on this, and what the effect of this genocide, but also the mass movement against it is on that side of politics, which is what I think a lot of us might have known you from before, taking a courageous line on. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is it Dominic or John?
Dominic. I was
Dominic.
just gonna raise a couple of points, but I just wanted to comment on Ian's point. I think with regard to the, if you like, what do they call it? This sort of story, I've forgotten the word, about Israel not being aware and so on. I think from what I can gather from the news that I've been listening to some time ago, the American New York Times did a big spread about how much information Israel had been given prior to October the 7th happening. So I just sort of make that point. It's not just the odd body here and there who are thinking these things. Because if you go on to think of it, this question of what they're going to do about Gaza, Israel has been pushing all the Palestinians down to the southern border with Egypt, and all it would take would be a few bombs to blow the fence, and under the conditions, there'd be thousands of Palestinians streaming across the border. The only problem they would face is the fact of all the Egyptian tanks that are lined up at the other side of the border to stop them entering. And I think that's a real indication of the massive support that Israel has among the Arab leadership in the area and among the Western leadership. Because the one thing that sort of stuck in my throat this past week was when 7 Europeans were murdered by the Israeli armed forces. There's a massive hue and cry throughout the Western world. Everybody's screaming, all the leading politicians, even Biden. There's 33,000 at least, possibly, and nobody knows how many dead in Palestine, in Gaza, are under the rubble of the Israeli bombing. But there's at least 33,000 dead, and that didn't make a monkey's difference. Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party in this country's line is, Israel has got the right to defend itself. I don't think anybody has ever seen a war, if you could call it a war, where you've got a prison camp being bombed and the loss of 33,000, and they're calling that a war, and they're calling that self-defense. I'm saying these things because the only way forward, and it's a bleak situation as far as the working class and particularly the left is concerned, that there's no movement in the labour movement. The trade unions in this country are passive. I don't know what the score is internationally, but it just shows you, and it's not to darken it and say we can't do anything. It's a question we've got to be realistic of the task ahead of trying to raise these things and trying to raise them with fellow workers or within the trade union movement, because that's the only solution. There's no other solution. Capitalism has got the answer of genocide, and we've got to face that. And it's only the labour movement that can stop this sort of slaughter going on. So I'll leave it at that point.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. If nobody else has their hand up, I'd like to make a few very brief points. And then if nobody else wants to come in, then Halima, you've got plenty of questions to answer and points to make. Just very, very briefly, I really just want to make a few bullet points. I'd be interested in Halima and your opinion. First of all, I think we should note the significance of the mass protests around the world, which is unprecedented, probably since the beginning of the Iraq War, when we had 30 million people on a simultaneous demonstration around the world, in protest against the coming war in Iraq. And since then, or perhaps you could say even before that, the anti-Vietnam war movement. But in other words, it's still, a long time since there's been this kind of movement. And the significant thing is that it shows the limitations of bourgeois propaganda, that in America, in the USA, in Britain, and many at least of the countries in Europe, where the governments are up until now have been 1000% in support of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, that nevertheless there's a majority of the populations in opinion poll after opinion poll and massive demonstrations of tens of thousands, perhaps even reaching 100,000. The population is able to see beyond the propaganda of the bourgeois media and of their politicians. And after all, in Britain, that means the politicians of both the Tories and the Labour leadership. So that's something I think which is a great source of encouragement and optimism, that people can see beyond the smokescreens put up by the ruling class. Secondly, I would also say on the more negative side that there's been such confusion about the motivations and the interests behind this war, that there has been, I'm not going to exaggerate it, but nevertheless it's something which is extremely disturbing, is that there has definitely been a resurgence of a kind of left anti-Semitism. I've seen again and again, I've seen posts on Facebook which are really hair-raising, really, really nauseating. I saw one recently saying, is it any wonder that the Jews have been persecuted throughout history and will continue to be persecuted throughout history when you see what's going on now? Another one saying, how can you not be anti-Semitic when they're committing Jewish genocide? These all came, I've seen, there are others too, I won't quote them, but these all came from left groupings on Facebook. It's not, I wouldn't exaggerate it, but nevertheless, it's something to be disturbed about and to counter and to watch. I would also, I mean, what's behind this is the kind of mythology that somehow the Jews have a secret, some kind of secret power by which they control the US government and the governments of all the Western nations and so on. There's some kind of secret conspiracy or blackmail which somehow holds them in thrall. And we have to remember, no time to go into this now, but we've discussed it many times, of why, who is controlling who in the end, who is an agent of who. It's not that the US government is an agency of the Zionists, but that the Zionists are a pawn in the hands of American imperialism, and that and I think from that point of view, I'd like to know again. I'd like to hear Halima's comments on this. What do you think is the likelihood that the USA is, I mean, it's only edging in a very, very tentative and very halting direction, but nevertheless towards pulling the rug from under Netanyahu, of trying to install a slightly more flexible, not so flexible if you like, but malleable regime. I think that the ruling class is getting scared by the reaction of public opinion, of working class opinion throughout the world, and I think they're afraid that any kind of strategy is going to be blown sky high by the policies of Netanyahu. Netanyahu has one agenda. He wants to stay out of jail. Up until October the 7th, let's remember, there were demonstration after demonstration after demonstration, day after day after day, calling for the resignation of Netanyahu and his government, which includes open, blatant, explicit fascists. And of course, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, he wants to keep the war going, the genocide going for as long as he possibly can, in order to stay out of jail. and to stay in power. But from the point of view of the ruling class of the world imperialism, that is not. They have other fish to fry. They have other interests at stake, more long term, more strategic interests. What should be finally? What would be our position? I agree with the comrades who say a two-state solution is just unviable. The only way there could be a two-state solution would be to have a kind of Palestinian Bantustan, which would be completely under the control, really another version of the West Bank as it is now, with a stooge regime, which was really subordinate to the Israeli government itself. Two-state solution, I think, is not a possibility. A one-state solution, of course, it's a very noble democratic idea, but can we see a reality? Why do we accept the limitations imposed 100 years ago or more under the Sykes-Picot plan, where they carved up the map of the entire Middle East, North Africa, West Asia, that whole region, and they simply drew arbitrary lines on the map and created nations and installed monarchies and so on completely arbitrarily, just on their own initiatives. After all, of course, the Israel-Palestine issue is the most dangerous and the most destabilizing of all the wars that are going on. But remember, we've had war after war. We have the Saudi Arabia and Iran constantly on the verge of war. We have the civil war in Yemen. We have the civil war in Syria. We had years of civil war in Lebanon. We had Black September in Jordan, and these are all outcomes of the imposition of artificial states and artificial borders laid down, as I say, after the First World War and after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The whole area just carved up by British and French imperialism at that time. Would it not be, if we're talking about solutions which are, I mean, all equally far out of reach as far as the situation is concerned, but if we're talking about the kind of aspirations that we should be aiming towards, would it not be better to be calling for a socialist federation of the entire region, in which all of the different religions and all of the different sects and all of the different cultures could all achieve freedom on a fraternal basis? I'm very interested to hear what Halima says and other comrades say about that. So that's all from me. David, yep.
Yes, look, as briefly as I can, because Halima, I'd like to hear what you have to say. But look, in my thinking, I'm drawn to this horrible conclusion that what we see is either a two-state solution, and I'll show you how grim that might be, or continuous war, because maybe the question I pose out of this is, for the people on the West Bank, do they feel that only war with various Arab nations turning towards Palestine and then waging war against Israel is a solution, which is more or less a Hezbollah, position? But I imagine that might be a common thought, given the devastation and the utter hatred that's been unleashed now, which is always there, but now is very visible. That might be a natural but a very ugly and situation. Or do we see, as currently the position is to have a continuous ceasefire, that ceasefire would be constructed out of Netanyahu on one side and Hamas on the other, and that's it. That's the two-state position. In fact, a horrific situation. But I even paused before I even say the words. But that might be the only type of two-state situation that there could be. But why I'm had to think down this road is that you have this absolutely vacuous situation in the BBC and elsewhere, as everyone's saying, well, after the war, we'll do this. After the war, we'll do that. There's no after the war. Well, can there be an after the war? I just raised that perspective or question.
Okay, thank you. Ian, is it very brief? Because Halima has a lot of...
It is, yeah.
to answer.
Just something I should have added to my last point on the witch hunt, that I think we're saying or asking Halima what you think as an eyewitness in that too. Whether Starmer's and official politics, I'm meaning in Britain now more generally, the particularly terrible line on this, as well as all the usual imperialist interests and so on, has been informed by the operation against Corbyn and how it wasn't challenged. So the starting point was very far back for our movement, even compared to a few years ago, on the accepting of the left anti-Semitism, meaning support for Palestine, and their non-support of Palestine being a principal dividing line against us on their own of their own choice. And then that being so, I think it's really driven the left split away from Starmer, even though, given what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, not so much reflected inside the Labour Party, but with events outside the Labour Party, the result in Rochdale, the growing support for Andrew Feinstein and so on, as well as showing up some of the populist right who are trying to pose as defenders of the people like Lee Anderson, God help us, as trying to ban a demo of 1 million people isn't very populist, but especially on the stuff with the split away from Starmer and the situation in the Labour Party and left of the Labour Party. So very interested what you think.
Okay, thank you. Right, Halima, you've got a lot of material to cover. You're very welcome. Please come in now.
Do forgive me if I forget any parts. Please just put it in the chat if there's something that I need to speak on. Thank you, Finn, for firstly sharing your experience to the West Bank. You touched on a very important point, talking about the anti-Zionist organizations that did exist in Israel. And I say it past tense because since October the 7th, I have a lot of Palestinian friends in Ramallah, but also I have a lot of anti-Zionist Jewish friends in Israel as well. And one of the things that immediately was apparent was there was a massive breakdown in relationships between the sides after October the 7th. And there were a few people that tried, again, like I was very much involved with a lot of the anti-Zionist Israelis inside the Israeli territories from Tel Aviv, etc. But there are very few. They are very few in number, and the ones that were persistent and were unshakable are still very few. One of them, she has a podcast. I'll put the link in below. She's a good friend of mine. I'm trying to get her to come to the UK this summer so she can speak to people who are willing to listen to that side of things. But she's had a lot of struggles trying to re-engage people that were, slightly on side, who have just completely gone the other way. So the immediate aftermath, obviously, before, as Roger did say, before October the 7th, there was weekly protests against Netanyahu. So what October the 7th did do was essentially reunite the Israeli society in a shared common goal, essentially, which is nationalism, essentially. So, as time went, obviously, we're now in a situation where it's been 6 months and the hostages haven't been retrieved. So now we're seeing that a reignited kind of battle against the government, where yesterday there was absolute bloodshed in Tel Aviv, where Israeli forces were attacking the Israeli protesters, essentially. So we are now beginning to see it again, the distrust growing. So I think, sorry, I forgot who had asked, but somebody had asked whether or not the polls were accurate. We are seeing now, because like I said, hostages have been killed. So, those are things that Israel has admitted, that they mistakenly friendly fire killed some hostages. So obviously now there's a sowing of doubt. We've seen, members of the public jumping over Knesset, trying to resolve, just trying to do anything to try and get their loved one back. We've also seen how many of the hostages that were released, their families being silenced essentially, and we don't really hear from them at all either. So internally inside Israel, I think I believe it was Eric who was speaking about how are we going to re-energize the youth essentially, and what is the political situation in for the Palestinians essentially. And I think that when we're talking about, is it going to be a political solution for the Palestinians, what's the next day, what's the day after, essentially how will we see an end to this apartheid system that's suffocating so many? A lot of people on the ground, Palestinians on the ground, of course, they're like, how can we now negotiate? I can't even look at them, when we walk amongst them and, see them completely protected, smiling, and we can't even speak for our brothers and sisters in Gaza, essentially. So, what I see and how I see it is that Israeli society will eat itself up. And I say that because then we're going back to the point of that I mentioned, and I think Eric also touched on from the American side, that there is a big push, which is, from this messianic prophecy of the Messiah returning, essentially. But most of Israeli society is atheist, and they don't believe. So when we see, these groups like Ben Gavir and Smotrich, and then the extremist Israeli settlers that live in the West Bank pushing for something that we know will end and will begin an all-out regional war, the liberals don't actually agree with that. And actually the religious extremists inside Israel hate the liberal Jews, the Jews that, wave the LGBTQ flag. They don't like the people in Tel Aviv. They see them as people who are, a disgrace to their own kind, essentially. They look down at those people. So there is, pockets of society in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, that are completely different in their mentality. Yes, they share the same goal of nationalism, but and Zionism as it's, the definition that the Western society try and portray it being, that it's just a fight for a Jewish homeland. Whereas the extremist side, which have taken over, like I said, majority of the government and have a lot of influence within government now, because these are the people that Netanyahu chose to surround himself with, are pushing for this more, this prophetic Messianic, push for the rebuilding of the third temple. If you look into the Temple Institute, there are big financial backers all around the world, including American billionaires who aren't even Jewish, essentially. So, as much as we want to talk about capitalism and socialism, we cannot ignore that there are believers of a faith, and, be it Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. And I include Muslim in that because we have Iran being as a power player who also believe that they are the true believers who will liberate the Muslims at the end of times. And this is the same ideology that Hezbollah also has, where we talk about the black flag and, being the true army. Essentially, Americans have their own view, the evangelical powers that be. Biden prescribes to it, Trump prescribes to it. That's why you don't see much difference in their position on Israel. And every leader has been consistent in prescribing to this evangelical Zionism. So essentially where we're at now is, we live amongst two worlds and two realities, where the people who are not believers, who may just, be atheist or agnostic, not prescribe to a particular religion, see the same storyline, but see it as the end of capitalism, as we're seeing that capitalism as a late stage capitalism, is ending, and the world that we know will be changed. And, again, there's a political side to the argument where we see that the Israel-Palestine issue is the political axis of the world. So essentially, when the occupation falls, the axis will shift, where there will be a new emergence of, you know, like I said, the end of capitalism and the progression of a socialist society, essentially. That's how Palestinians on the ground actually see it. Ones that don't believe in any faith and do not prescribe to any faith see it as late stage capitalism ending and a new world coming emergence for that. And then the people on the religious side, like I said, I spent time in amongst the Jewish communities as well as in the Holy Church of the Sepulchre, because I really wanted to understand what is the feeling amongst the priests and the nuns that are living there as well. What is their perception? And they were also talking about, you know, the return of Jesus. Of course, when you went to Al-Aqsa, and I, you know, was amongst the Muslims, they were also saying the same thing. So, you know, these conversations, it's not fair to ignore it, because it's a reality that they are living, and it's a reality that people are actually acting upon. When we, you know, a lot of these nations, of these world leaders that are the big power players, do prescribe, and there is a religious element to it. We talk about even Erdogan in Turkey, you know, we talk about even Putin. When you do listen to what he says, he does talk about how his Orthodox Christian beliefs as well. So these are, you know, again, when you consider Jerusalem as the religious heartbeat of the entire world, essentially, it's so charged that it is something that, you know, a lot of nations will be invested in one way or another. Going back to the point that Eric made, and in the sense of how do we re-energize the youth, you know, when they see that the Middle East conflict is so far, you know, it's not going to affect us and all of that. Well, it's no secret that a lot of the world leaders in the West, in Britain and in America, are talking about conscription. They are now trying to groom the population into understanding that World War III is inevitable. So what we do not want is, you know, as anybody who doesn't really believe in, you know, Middle Eastern politics is far away, it's not going to impact us, but we do know that World War III is something that's going to directly impact everybody. And when our leaders are talking about conscription, it is at our doorstep. We are in a pivotal state. We are in a pivotal position where both the UK and the US are having their elections this year. So essentially, those are the conversations that need to be had. You know, are you willing to put your life on the line for a nation that does not care about you, that, you know, absolutely suffocates you as a working class, that only serves a specific class of people? They're going to drag you into war. And I think those are the conversations that absolutely need to be had and need to be brought forward to the reality that, you know, we're all at risk. It's not just something that's happening in the Middle East. Biden yesterday literally said, when they asked him about, are you going to stop arms sales to Israel? He said, I asked them to do what they're doing. Now, what that's doing is making America a direct target, because they are directly implicating themselves in the situation in Gaza. So, you know, these statements by Biden confidently saying, I asked them to do what they're doing, you know, essentially is a declaration of war, that, you know, we are complete participants and we are collaborators in this. And in fact, I will take ownership that I'm telling them to enact this genocide. You know, what's next? What's the day after? It would be the war will come straight to our doorstep, be it with all the enemies that we're creating, you know. You know, I think Ian talked a lot about the British politics side. I think if I start talking about Corbyn and Owen Jones and these individuals, we'd end up going into a different type of rabbit hole, because it is not as clear as you see it. You know, one thing that I've been consistent in saying is that there's Corbyn the man, the individual that people love and admire, you know, that people meet on a day-to-day. Then there's the brand of Corbyn, which is created by a group of elite individuals who have ties in everything, essentially. Now, you know, we talked about the protests You know, the Stop the War protests, that where we had 1 million people come up for the Iraq War, then we had 1 million people show up at the beginning of the Palestine War. These individuals are unelected individuals who decide who's going to speak at every event, who is going to, how they contain these protests, you know, and often it's not, they don't liaise with Palestinian people or Iraqi people, depending on the protests. They determine for you how you're going to be angry, and we set it in the parameters, but they're unelected people that have been in those positions for a very long time, and they were entirely connected in manufacturing what the Corbyn movement essentially was. Now, Corbyn, it's no secret that he's not somebody that is very confident or somebody that is powerful as a leader. So he surrounded himself with all these political thinkers who were compromised, unfortunately, who were compromised and had very dodgy links. And the people that he kept around close to him ended up betraying him and ended up passing information to Starmer the moment Starmer came in, and ended up working for Starmer. So there was a number of dirty things that happened on the inside, you know. So when we talk about the brand of Corbyn, essentially the image and why the working class, you know, really did struggle to buy into his idea, the manifesto. The manifesto of 2019 was a brilliant manifesto. It would have helped everybody, but it was written by a class that wasn't the working class. So when it was sold to the working class couldn't buy it because it just seemed like it was, you know, absolutely fairy tale and all of that. It wasn't spoken in the working class language. It wasn't something that was relatable. It was very alienable. And, you know, when we had these kind of discussions internally, they would just block their ears, you know. When we talk about Owen Jones, essentially, and Owen Jones was allowed to be a member up until this point, right? He wasn't investigated, he wasn't suspended, and he has said far more than anybody else that was a member of the Labour Party. Essentially, Diane Abbott, Kate Ossamore, Rupert Huck, they all got suspended for saying far less than Owen Jones has said in this Gaza war. So what I believe Owen Jones's kind of position now was, again, he was allowed to be, you know, in that position where he could speak about the Gaza war for a specific reason. Because then when we see now he's created this "We Deserve Better." What is this movement about? A few people who worked in it had been monitored, essentially. And Owen Jones does have deep connections in Keir Starmer's office. Now, when we talk about the Labour files and why he didn't speak on the Labour files and try to discredit me, you know, it's because my legal case implicates very key figures that are very close to him in Keir Starmer's office, essentially. So, you know, in terms of Owen Jones's position now, he stepped down as a member of the Labour Party without being investigated, which means by the Labour Party rule books, he can go back to the Labour Party whenever he wishes. He waited up until the point where it's too late for anyone to trigger a leadership election where Keir Starmer is going to be our Prime Minister, whether we like it or not. Whereas 2 years ago, when he had the opportunity, when the Labour files to come out to make an issue of exactly the same things they're talking about now, they chose to be silent. So that's my kind of gripe with these individuals, where I'm like, okay, why now when it's too late and there's nothing we can do to remove Keir Starmer as the leader? Again, there is so much I can talk about how Keir Starmer got into the position, the whole anti-Semitism crisis, but I think I'll end up swallowing too much of everybody's time talking about that, and I think maybe I'll have to come back for a separate discussion just to talk about Corbyn and Starmer, essentially. Because I know it's going to lead to more questions, and of course I would want to, the reason why I decided to be a whistleblower was to tell everybody the truth about those years and what's coming ahead as well, essentially. And just on Ian's question, sorry, I didn't receive any kind of apology. Unfortunately, many of those people have me on my personal social medias. A lot of individuals from Al-Jazeera as well knew I was in Palestine during October the 7th and they tried contacting an individual who is standing in the next election, contacted me on October the 6th for information. October the 7th happened. They knew I was in Palestine and didn't bother talking to me or, like, you know, making sure I was okay. So my personal view and a lot of these people, there's a lot of careerists, and I won't publicly go against them if our views are aligned on this Starmer issue, because again, who does it help? But there are a number of careerists that are in it for their own interests, essentially.
Well, Halima, first of all, thank you so much. It's been really one of the most interesting discussions we've had. And on the question of, on these questions about the Labour Party, I strongly support your suggestion that you come back and we have a separate discussion on all of those issues. Thank you so much for coming. We do meet every week. We've had comrades from around the world. In fact, I made a calculation that we've had comrades from a total of about 60 countries who participated or given first-hand reports from different struggles around the world. And as I say, this was one of the most successful of that genre of meetings that I've attended. Next week we have again a first-hand report from a comrade from Senegal. Now, I don't know if comrades have been following, but amid all the upheavals in Africa in the recent period, mostly defeats, mostly coups and civil wars, but there's one very positive development in Senegal, where an attempted presidential coup was prevented and stalled, and a new president has been elected, a left Democrat, who was in jail up until just a few weeks ago. So we're having a comrade from Senegal speaking. That's this time next week. You'll get a notice. Anybody here who is not on the mailing list, please, I think everybody is, but please do join, and please spread the word around your friends and your associates and your comrades, because I think these meetings give us a unique opportunity, which I don't think you can find anywhere else, for a free, open forum for discussion of the crucial issues facing the working class worldwide. So if there's no other comments, want to make any announcements? Right then, once again, thank you so much to Halima and to everybody who participated, and see you next week. Bye, comrades.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.